Hello and welcome to this short video on critical thinking for coaches. So if you're watching this, you're interested in critical thinking, and I assume that you would know what critical thinking is. Critical thinking is essentially understanding, are your thoughts logical? Can you make accurate judgments from your thoughts? But it's a very difficult thing to do. And the reason it's very difficult is because people aren't naturally gifted at understanding the logic of their thoughts. That's a process that has to be worked out. And similarly, people are also biased. So let's understand those two features of critical thinking. First, do your thoughts follow logic? For example, I once worked with a coach who stated that this player, let's call her Susie, was very lazy. She was very, very talented, but she was very, very lazy. And she never chased back the ball. She never participated in extra challenge outside of her having possession. She essentially waited until she got passed to. So I challenged this coach and said, how do you know she's lazy? And he says, well, she doesn't chase back the ball. That just tells you that she doesn't chase back the ball. It doesn't tell you that she's lazy. He says, is there any benefits to her not chasing back the ball? No, she's just lazy. It's showing bad teamwork. And then I pointed out that actually elite players cover less ground than amateur players. If you look at the time motion analysis of soccer players or football players, they cover less ground because they read the game better, therefore they do less work, and because they do less work they're less tired, and because they're less tired they're therefore more fresh to go for sprints and essentially beat their opponents when it matters. So it's the point of, she had maybe got a better economy of movement and economy of process, whereas that coach was reading it as being lazy. So I think really, if you want to summarize what logic is trying to prove yourself wrong, and it's very difficult to do that. Logic is understanding what you think is true and then testing that against other knowledge that you have, or even better, having someone else test that. And the reason you would have somebody else test that is because we're all inherently biased, which is a second feature of critical thinking. Critical thinking is hard to do because we have a biased mind. And while you might think you aren't biased, we can essentially look at this and say, pick your favourite football team. You go and watch a game and you listen to an opponent and you listen to their story of events versus your story of events of how a match went, and you'll find out there's big differences. And the reason there's big differences is because you're both looking at it from a different perspective. And therefore, when we think of this in coaching, it's really important for you to understand how you coach from a point of view of actually what you think you're doing, but also what other people think you're doing. And that's where having a second pair of eyes comes in really handy. It's often better to have two people look at a problem than it is one. And the reason being, a different pair of eyes will find a different way of solving it. One pair of eyes often only sees one problem, one solution, and cannot think outside their trained pattern of thought. And this is because we have this belief called confirmation bias. It's a heuristic, it's a shortcut, it's essentially a way of your brain saving energy, which is, if I believe something, I'm not going to waste time trying to disprove it. So for example, some people believe in Santa, right? And they're not going to waste time trying to disprove that. Why would you do that? If you believe in Santa Claus, you wouldn't waste time trying to disprove that. But if you had some doubt and you didn't believe in him, and something big happened that revealed a change, your entire opinion would flip right. But until that point where there's a doubt or an inkling, you actually probably won't question it. But this is the same thing with adults, not just children, and flippant examples like Santa Claus. We all have ways of thinking that are very, very logical, but actually when you look at it from a different perspective, then we understand it from a much more logical point of view. For example, if we look at the research and performance analysis in football, we used to say that an average player would run 11 kilometers in a game. This then became the benchmark of fitness, that a player must be able to run 11 kilometers. But actually they didn't run 11 kilometers all in one go. It was a mixture of sprinting, it was a mixture of deceleration, acceleration, and agility, change of direction, jogging, changing positions, walking. So the process of how a player needed to move was measured by one viewpoint, which was distance, and therefore during a period in the 90s, players used to run lots and lots of laps because that was perceived to get them fit, but it didn't actually transfer into the key skill or the key movement skills of the game. And that's because they had one view and they didn't have a second pair of eyes to look at it, to challenge it. The same thing will continually happen within sport as we develop and grow to an understanding where we have a clean and clear picture of the demands of a game. But you as a coach are tasked with a difficult situation because you can never be right. And what I mean by this is that if you think about how you coach, you have to make a decision based on development versus performance. You're either developing your team, developing the width and depth of their skills and repertoire, of their tactics, or you're aiming for performance. Those two features cannot be delivered at the same time. At some point, there's going to be a conflict of your values between developing versus performance. And at that point, you then have to make a decision. There is no real right answer. That's up to you and your philosophy of how you're coaching and what you're trying to do to make that decision. If it's entirely participation and fun, it's probably going to be more development. If it's entirely performance at the elite end and putting silverware on the table, it's all going to be about performance. But chances are you're neither at both of those two extremes. You're somewhere in this grey area in the middle, and that's where actually your views and values are going to be challenged, not only by yourself but also by your team and your players. So it's important for you to be clear, think critically about what your actions mean and what your actions are trying to do, and that you can explain them from a point of view that fits in with a logical rationale. So a very straightforward example of how you might actually find a more simpler way of looking at this confound of understanding the difference between two different points is actually to look at what's the value in doing a simple drill. You do a simple straight line drill where players are passing and receiving the ball, they're working on trapping the ball, one touch control and passing off. It's unopposed, it's just practice of the skill. Is that a good thing to do? Yes. Is it a bad thing to do? Yes. What I mean by that is it's a good thing to do because repetition enhances skill, memory and learning. It's a great way to get in repetitions of practice of a skill, and if it's challenging enough and the passes are hard enough and it's challenging the skill will be being developed. However, it's completely removed from any game scenario where the person is making a decision, therefore it is also bad. It has a cost. But we could argue that instead of doing a simple straight line drill, we'll put people into a game scenario. What's the benefit of that? They then have to have visual awareness of looking up, looking for the pass and looking around. They also have to be aware of tackles and oppositions coming in. And they also have to perform the skill under pressure. Is that good? Yes. Is that bad? Yes. It's bad because in those scenarios, players which are more competent are more likely to get more touches and therefore develop at a faster rate than players that are less developed. Therefore, for some players, that might not be ideal given their age and stage of training. So what we can see is from a simple point of comparing two drills, such as a straight line drill versus a game, we have the conundrum that both are excellent but both are terrible. Both have the capacity for developing one thing and the no capacity for developing the other, and vice versa. And that's why it's important to both have a mixture, but also that you understand that every action you do as a coach has a cost. And this is fundamental to critical thinking. So I want to give you some simple things that I think about that are really useful for coaches to understand about critical thinking. Number one, everything you do is wrong. And also not wrong. It's good and it's bad. There is always a cost. There's no action that you can take that does not have some downside on a pitch as a coach. You can give a player direct instructions, but you limit their ability to then learn for themselves. You can ask a player questions and let them find out the answer for themselves, but their rate of learning will be slower, but there will be a skill that they will keep with them and take on to their next year of training. Whereas if you continually give them instructions, you limit their own self-development, but you enhance the rate of short-term performance. Everything you do has a cost, so you must always be looking for the downside of what you do as well as the upside. This isn't always easy to see, and therefore that's why it's beneficial to have a critical friend to come in and question you about what you're trying to do, and is it working, and is what you're trying to do consistent with what you're actually delivering. So that second pair of eyes is really useful. The next question that I would ask myself to enhance my critical thinking is, where's the evidence for this? Essentially, where is the evidence that what I'm doing or what I believe is of benefit and more so than something else? So, is there any evidence to say that me playing conditioned games will transfer into my team learning 11-a-side tactics? Well, if I play conditioned games and I measure their ability to perform 11-a-side tactics, that may or may not transfer in. But that brings in the issue that I'm measuring it, and I might be biased, and I might assume that what I'm doing is enhancing the performance. And that's why then actually having a performance analysis might help you create a more critical, a more fact-based process of judging what you're doing in training and whether or not that brings in the approach to learning. So we have to be critical in that we don't actually create evidence to support our own beliefs. So when you look for evidence, it's often best to try and get evidence from other coaches and other places that will disprove what you say and disprove what you believe and disprove how you act. So instead of asking coaches, if I do this, which I'm currently doing, will that produce X? Because people are more than likely suggest, yes, it will, because they don't want to challenge you. What you need to do is ask the difficult question of, I'm doing this to produce that, how is that wrong? How could this possibly be wrong? Can somebody prove me wrong? Unless you open up the possibility for somebody to speak freely and criticize what you do, and again, you're not going to do this in public over Facebook to the entire world. You're going to have to do it with trusted friends. And also you're going to have to develop the courage, if you want to be a really good coach, to do that with people you don't trust, or people who actually won't hold back, because sometimes our friends or people we have relationships with in coaching are more likely to support us and support our beliefs as opposed to actually criticize them. So it's important to bring in the critical mind of somebody who actually maybe doesn't like you and actually get their opinion. Similarly, if you're working with a team, it's important to ask them how they think the training's going and how they think it could be better and what has been done badly. And that will allow you to get a more critical view of what you're doing as a coach or as a manager. So the question is, where is the evidence for this? More importantly, to refine it, how am I doing this wrong? What could be done better? There are a couple of really quick fire ways to understand when you smell rubbish, to put it politely. So if you ever hear somebody say a statement and they use the word surely, that generally means that they're making an assumption. Surely if I get the players to do this warm-up, they'll all be injury free. That implies that somebody's jumping from a thought into an action without an evidence base. Now they may well have the evidence base, but actually surely is an indication that what they're saying is not too well grounded or may not be too well grounded, and they may not understand what they're doing. For example, it may well be that chosen warm-up does reduce injury rates, but they don't understand that and they don't have the competence or ability or knowledge to be able to express how and why that can be evidenced. And that's when people use the word surely. Now, you don't need me to tell you where to look to see this all the time. I'm sure if you look at, I just did it myself. I bet you if you look at politicians, you're going to find the word surely being used an awful lot. And that's a pure indication that they don't have the underpinning to know the actual hard facts that prove the point they're making. They're asking you to make a leap of faith and assumption with them. So if you ever hear the word surely being used, that should send off a wee alarm bell, meaning, I wonder, does that person actually have the evidence for that? And that's when you can ask a really critical question. The other trick that is really useful in critical thinking is absolute statements. So basically, an absolute statement is a statement that is always right. For a team to win a game, they must always score more than the opposition. That's an absolute statement. It's always true. You must always score more if you want to win a game. For you to be a good footballer, you need to be able to sprint 40 meters in 4 seconds. Is that always true? People make statements like that and they attach facts with absolute statements to say all good footballers are this, or for example, all good basketballers are above 6'4". That's not necessarily true. And also what's not true is everyone above 6'4" is not necessarily even good at basketball. So we need to understand when people make absolute statements that can either be false or true, they are very dangerous because they indicate that thinking has stopped. They indicate that there is a viewpoint there that is so extreme there is nothing that can challenge it. And those absolute statements are things which we need to challenge. So whenever you hear the word of always, never, this must, that must, it should, things which are very finite and deliberate. And I think this is where you're going to have to go off into your own coaching world and think, what absolute statements do people use? Because absolute statements mean that there's no exception to the rule. And whenever we see that, when we speak in terms where there's no exception to the rule, we limit ourselves to develop outside of that and see new ground. So it's important never, that's an absolute statement. It's important to think around the possibilities of what's been said, so that you do not create a binary scenario of black or white, it's always like this, which may limit future opportunities for development. So it's important most of the time not to use absolute statements or listen to people make absolute statements and not question them. That would be an absolute statement if I said we should never use absolute statements, which in itself is ironic because that is an absolute statement. Right, so to summarize, critical thinking is all about you challenging your logic and your thought process. It's about using someone else. It's about finding out where the evidence is. It's finding out what's better than what needs improved. And it's about challenging your biases that you're going to have inbuilt. And just one last word on biases. There's over 180 different types of biases within the human. And it's your job to not rely on those. They exist because it's nice to have shortcuts, because it makes it easy and saves your energy. But actually, performance is about thinking critically and pushing new ground. And that's why critical thinking is really important. So now we've thought about critical thinking, I want to leave you with something of value to take away. What I want to leave you with is a thought that there are 3 things you need to consider whenever you're trying to do a good job. Those 3 things are what the evidence says. Are there facts to support what you're doing? What you're good at. Can you actually pull it off? Are you good enough, competent enough, skilled enough to deliver what it is you're trying to do? And what do the people you're working with want? There's no point you having all the evidence and having all the skills if they don't want it. If you have all the evidence and skills to say that making 4,000 passes a day, and you have the ability to monitor that and qualify what a decent pass is, will enhance performance 300%, and that would work. It doesn't matter if the players don't want that, if the management don't want that, if the physio doesn't want that. Okay, you have to consider what works in your environment, consider what you're good at, and consider what the evidence says. And those 3 things will help you find a course of action. What we would call that is evidence-based coaching. It's based in evidence, but it's not based solely in evidence. It's based in the evidence of your interpretation of the context and culture in which you coach, as well as the scientific evidence of what is good coaching, as well as what you can actually do. So that is why we critically think, so that we can have evidence-based coaching. And that's the same formula that's used in evidence-based medicine and evidence-based psychology. So what can you do? What do they want? And what does the evidence say? Thanks very much. I hope you've enjoyed this, and there will be another input on reflective practice for you guys. I look forward to meeting with you and working with you in the future.